and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, privacy in modern age, a deal between US and EU to protect the privacy of EU citizens faces skepticism as the US says it won't back down on data surveillance. Belt and Road Initiative. As plans for the project forge ahead, we take a look at China's multilateral diplomacy and the potential impact across several nations. And we start today's show with EU-US Privacy Shield. Brussels and Washington clinched a new transatlantic deal that aims to facilitate exchanges of data between firms in both regions. On Monday, the European Commission issued the legal context of the Privacy Shield. Once adopted, it would urge US firms to comply with new rules that align with EU standards. Before our discussion, let's take a look.
A new transatlantic data transfer deal. The EU and US clinched a deal on a new data transfer framework that will govern how Europe's user data is sent to America. The previous framework, Safe Harbor, was quashed by a top EU court last year after revelations about US government surveillance caused political backlash in Europe. Under the new agreement, the EU-US Privacy Shield, there will be an annual review to check that the new system is working properly. And the US side will appoint an ombudsman to handle complaints from EU citizens about the Americans spying on their data. European data privacy watchdogs will also work with their US counterpart, the Federal Trade Commission, to address any flagged problems. The announcement of the pact was welcomed by transnational businesses. Technology companies like Google and Facebook especially rely on data transfer to conduct routine business activities. However, after Snowden's leak, public concerns about data privacy have been raised. The current debate between Apple and the FBI has again brought the issue to the fore. The new deal is still waiting for the sign-off of EU members. Will it really protect European users' data privacy in exchanges between the two regions? It's hard to say at the moment.
And for more on this very interesting topic, we're joined in Boston by Mr. Robert Siciliano, who is a security expert with IT company Hotspot Shield. Meanwhile, in Washington, we are joined by Dr. Ernest McDuffie, the founder and CEO of the Global McDuffie Group. That is a private consulting firm focused on cybersecurity education. And in Brussels, in Europe, we are joined by Mr. Peter Klepp. He is the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe. Gentlemen, welcome to the three of you. First of all, Mr. Klepp, many wonder whether this new agreement yet to be adopted by both sides likely to be just cosmetic in terms of protecting real privacy of the end users in Europe.
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between, on the one hand, protecting people from companies, and on the other, protecting people from government interference. With regards to protecting them from companies, I think the legal framework for European individuals to challenge big companies has definitely been improved, while of course keeping the obligation for every person that when they sign up to Facebook, they know that according to the general terms, certain things will happen with their privacy. Secondly, when it comes to protecting people in Europe from US Secret Service spying, I think there's also quite a bit of progress in the sense that there's now this ombudsman, there's for the first time commitment from the US side to take this concern into account. So I think overall it is a step forward.
Mr. Siciliano, do you agree with that? After all, you are working on security.
Yeah, I think previous speaker certainly is optimistic. I'm not so much. I think a lot of it is semantics, that in the end it really revolves around the honor system, and as long as everyone is being honest in their goal to be transparent, then we'd be fine. But as time progresses and as more data is transferred amongst both United States and European companies. Governments will want even more access to it. Companies will find other ways to exploit it. And in the end, I'm not sure that any of this has any teeth.
Earlier, we did listen very clearly to Mr. Klepp talking about privacy, and he mentioned that after all, everybody signed on the deal before they use certain services. And therefore, I want to get your opinion, Mr. Siciliano, because there are many services we need to have in modern days, and we do not have much other options. We have to sign up on it because the other choices seem to do not provide much alternatives. So are end users in a situation that they are likely to be exploited anyway by companies and governments, and they're in such an inferior position to compete and argue? Mr. Siciliano.
Well, there's two significant motivations here. One, of course, is security, and security is a motivation that keeps governments wanting more access. And then the other motivation, of course, is money. And money often trumps everything. And so there is certainly a delicate balance between privacy and security, one that we continue to debate. And in the end, honestly, money often ends up winning.
Dr. McDuffie, you and I have been talking about Apple's deal vis-a-vis FBI. It is still going on. Every day there's new development. What do you make of this specific deal, at least between governments, Europe and the United States? Will they really solve the problem that many are concerned about privacy, about money likely to exploit the rights of citizens?
So there's two factors here. First, the deal in question, the European U.S. Privacy Shield, deals with companies specifically. So, you know, the individuals are kind of a secondary effect as they interact with the specific companies. And certainly having a transparent bilateral agreement between the U.S. and the EU is a step in the right direction. The fact that they had attempted this already a few years ago with Safe Harbor and found it inadequate and went back to the table and tried to address those issues and now have made it even stronger, I think is a positive step. You want to have some kind of a relationship in paper on the table so people know what the rules are. So whether it's perfect or not, I don't think any agreement is perfect right out of the box, but definitely a step in the right direction. And the fact that it's going to be reviewed periodically means that there's room for improvement.
There are two things it seems that a lot of you have mentioned. For journalists like us, it is also important, these two things. We're being told the stories are about following the money, many of the stories we cover. And the other clue we should follow is whether governments are trustworthy to begin with. So on that point, I would like to go back to Mr. Klepp for your opinion. You heard from Mr. Siciliano talking about his views. He seemed to be much more skeptical than you are. What do you make of it? And is this deal really likely, on the one hand, about companies, but on the other hand, eventually it should be about end users, because otherwise these American companies would not even would have only limited access to the European markets if things are not going to the right direction?
Well, in terms of protecting people from government abuse, I do think the deal is a step forward. Probably not sufficient, but then this is the eternal trade-off between security and privacy. With regards to enabling companies to make money, we should keep in mind that companies will only be able to make money if they actually provide a service. So what really happens is the more you bind the hands of these companies who rely heavily on databases and user information, the less able they are going to be to provide services to customers. Secondly, the more bureaucratic you make it for them, the harder it's going to be for small companies, new companies that want to innovate, that want to challenge the big players. You know, Facebook, Google are going to manage to deal with this, but smaller competitors may not be.
Mr. Siciliano, but how should we really look at this deal? Because the reason why more and more American companies, including Apple, some suggest, are more caring about the privacy of their users is because of the Snowden revelation, and consumers were upset, whether in Europe, in the US, or elsewhere, about these tech companies selling, quote unquote, information to the governments, as long as the latter wants. So that, of course, is debated in various countries and under various different circumstances. But what do you make of the intention of the companies involved in this deal? Can governments monitor companies well?
Well, the companies involved want to know what they can and can't do. They want specific guidelines that they should adhere to. They don't want there to be any questions as to whether they can or can't slurp up certain amounts of data, what they can and can't do with it. They want everything to be specifically defined. And when you see European countries suing American companies to in regards to privacy issues based on information that they are grabbing, slurping, it ends up hurting these companies, and so they can alleviate a lot of the litigation by having well-defined rules to follow. So in that regard, in that respect, it's a good thing for these companies so that they can effectively conduct business without continually being up against litigation.
But Mr. McDuffie, if I understand right, the technological innovation and how it's being applied in real life has been going much beyond the legislations and government agreements, and therefore, on the one hand, you could say tech companies are trying to find very clearly the lines of legal and not legal, but on the other hand, it seems to also give them the leeway of looking for loopholes as technology develops, as application of technologies being spread around very quickly.
So there's a couple of points here. Number one, it's not just about the user, the everyday citizen interface with the companies. There's also the issue of company to company, particularly for multinationals doing business across borders. It's a real hindrance not to have these kind of clear-cut rules in place in order for that business model to be effective. The other point that you make is absolutely true. Technology will always be ahead of legislation, so there's always that kind of gray area as new technology comes online. But the even bigger issue is it's a global issue. It's not just an issue between information between the U.S. and the EU. If companies go to third parties outside of those two, so none of these rules would apply at all. So the global supply chain, the kind of arrangement that we're making between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and the EU, really need to be global deals for them to be effective, because there's always other ways around if you just don't deal with the two countries involved directly and go to third parties outside of the agreement.
It is no secret, Mr. Clapp, internationally speaking, there has been an enormous lack of agreements in terms of technology innovation and also information privacy. At the UN, there's a system dealing with that, but has failed so far to reach anything that not only between US and EU, but also many other countries as well, as Mr. McDuffie mentioned. Is this deal likely to be an interesting case study? Is it going to be a worthwhile case study for the others? Mr. Clapp.
Yeah, I think it will be. Of course, you should keep in mind that the European Court of Justice will still most likely rule about this, whether it will be satisfied with the changes that have been made. Now, I think that we need to be careful, though, not to sort of constrain companies into some kind of a very inflexible international regulatory framework. I mean, the real danger to privacy at the end of the day will not be prevented by regulation, but will be prevented by technology, for example, encryption technology. And what we see is that the authorities in the United States, but also elsewhere, are trying to prevent companies from developing this. There was recently the case with Apple refusing or trying to block US government attempts to intervene into Apple's encryption technology.
Right.
So I think we definitely need to allow companies to develop that so people can basically protect themselves.
Can we really depend on technology? Can we really depend on the good feelings and the so-called honest attitude coming from companies, even though they were not honest years ago and now appear to be honest? Well, as long as they're doing good things, it's good for us, for the end users and consumers. But Mr. McDuffie, what can we depend on, particularly for individual consumers? They are feeling extremely helplessness.
Yeah, so it's really a matter of trust, right? Do you trust the companies you're dealing with? Do you trust the governments that you're living under? And it's the individual user's responsibility to be informed as to what's going on, what the actual current technology is, and what you can do as an individual to make sure that you take advantage of all the technology that's available for you. It's one of those things that you really can't put in a box. Technology research is advancing around the globe under all kinds of different environments, some that are completely out of the control and the view of any government. And so these technological advances will continue to happen regardless of any type of regulation, whether it's bilateral or global or whatever. So as an individual, you have to remain constant learning, in a learning mode,
right,
to stay on top of what's happening with the technology. And you got to take that responsibility on for yourself.
Wow, Mr. McDuffie, that's quite a high requirement, I have to say, even for technology experts like you. I saw you smile, but let me go to you, Mr. Siciliano. So our consumers, our individuals these days, the certain weaker party, how can they change their fate? Can anyone help? Are they dependable? Your judgment.
Well, in the end, the consumer has the ability to vote, and if they are supporting those who are in favor or not of certain, encryption standards, certain security protocols, privacy trumping security, or vice versa, they have a certain say. But in the end, there's no question about it that personal responsibility is fundamental. Understanding what your risks and responsibilities are. It's a double-edged sword. Technology, we love it, but at the same time, it can cause all kinds of issues in our personal and professional lives. Becoming fully informed, I think, is fundamental. It's absolutely necessary today. The pace of technology is, far exceeding, the laws in place. So it's important that consumers are aware of what their rights and responsibilities are.
Are we going to see a trend eventually, Mr. Klepp, briefly from you? As there's so much attention spotlight on the so-called privacy issue, and people's requirement for that is getting ever more urgent. Are we going to see new technologies ever popping up more actively about privacy, how to protect privacy, and even new technologies popping up, while at the same time, how to use this technology and prevent the loss of privacy also would like to emerge at the same time? Is that likely to be the trend for the next stage of technology?
Well, I do think so. I think there's a very big demand among consumers. For example, if you look at the reaction of privacy campaigners towards this EU-US deal, they were very disappointed, although I think it is a small step in the right direction. But I do think that people realize that, they cannot expect everything from the regulator so they sort of will have to rely on themselves. So I think that feeling will in the end prevail and will increase the demand to ever more technological protection for privacy.
Ever-changing world. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for shedding some lights on what we are dealing with, at least for now. Peter Klepp, Ernest McDuffie, and also Robert Siciliano. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Thanks. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. The Belt and Road Initiative, as plans for the project forge ahead, we take a look at China's multilateral diplomacy and the potential impact across several nations. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, and now we continue our series of discussions on China's diplomacy, China's global vision. Today we'll talk about China's multilateral diplomacy. China is already involved in international affairs, but aims to play an even bigger role in multilateral diplomacy. In recent years, China has contributed toward dealing with the Ukraine issue, Iran nuclear negotiations, and even more. And in order to improve the global governance system and toward the goal of multilateralism, China also proposed the Belt and Road initiatives. Take a look.
Sharing a vision of a multilateral world. In recent years, China has continued its integration into many global issues, taking gradual steps towards the center of the international stage. China has made it clear that it's willing to undertake international obligations, and in 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping launched the One Belt, One Road initiative, which aims to connect major Eurasian economies through infrastructure, trade, and investment. In its largest definition, the Belt and Road Initiative would include 65 countries, 4.4 billion people, and about 40% of global GDP. The initiative will contain 2 international trade connections, the ocean-bound Maritime Silk Road and the land-based Silk Road Economic Belt. As a major destination of the Maritime Silk Road in ancient times, Italy continues to play a pivotal role in China's new Belt and Road Initiative. Today, Italy's relations with China have the potential to again be ahead of the rest of Europe. Since 2014, Sino-Italian financial and monetary relations have developed dramatically. In the past 12 months, Italy has surpassed the UK, becoming the top destination in Europe for Chinese outbound investment. As a key hub and transfer stop on the land-based ancient Silk Road, Iran is also ready to join hands with China in the Belt and Road Initiative, especially following the announcement that Western sanctions on the country will be lifted. China has been Iran's top trading partner for the past 7 years. In 2014, bilateral trade volume exceeded $50 billion, some 15 times larger than that of the 1990s. Observers say that the Belt and Road Initiative will greatly enhance economic and trade relations between China and relevant countries. It's expected that China will approach the project with pragmatism. Observers say that China's Belt and Road could potentially contribute to the future of global governance, as multilateralism is an inevitable trend.
For more discussion about that, we're joined here in the Beijing studio, Ms. He Wenping, who is a research fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, ma'am. Meanwhile, also join us in 2 locations in Beirut. We're having Professor Mohammad Marandi from University of Tehran. He is there on a business trip. And also in Paris, we are joined by Dr. Nicola Casarini, who is the research head for Asia at the Italian Institute of International Affairs based in Rome. Welcome to the 3 of you. The Belt and Road initiatives and China's link to the different countries along it. May I have your views first, Professor Marandi? Iran can be a very different country. We have learned the recent result of the parliamentary election. We have also learned the gradual lifting of sanctions toward Iran. How much momentum do you think all of these internal and outside changes could eventually bring Iran a new position in terms of its relations with China?
Yes, I think the very fact that Iran can repeatedly hold elections in the country for parliament, the presidency, local elections, and otherwise, shows that Iran is a very stable country, a very dynamic country, and this can happen in a country, the fact that this can happen in a country that is surrounded largely by chaos, civil wars, and family dictatorships, I think reveals that Iran is a partner that can be relied on. It is the rock of stability in this region. And in addition, I think that the nuclear agreement between Iran and the P5+1 gives a greater opportunity for countries like China, as well as others, to do trade with Iran. And thirdly, I would also point out that in the region, Iran is now being seen by the populations. For example, here in Beirut, I'm at a conference where one of the central themes is Wahhabism and the threat of Wahhabism. People are seeing Iran across the globe as being the main protector of the minorities and the people in this region against extremism. So I think putting these together shows that Iran is a very good partner for anyone who wishes to do trade.
What about the lifting of sanctions? How fast do you think, Professor Morandi, that Iran could gather itself together, even though it has already got some very strong economic link with China earlier, but creating new opportunities and new possibilities for not only China but also others as well? You have got your own multilateralism, just as China is also developing its own strategy on that point as well. Professor.
Well, I think that the lifting of the sanctions is creating greater opportunities, especially for European countries. But I think that for China, as well as Russia, because of their close relationship with the country over the past few years, is still a priority. And in Iran, the development of the Silk Road, or the One Belt, One Road policy, is very key, because Iran does most of its trade to the west, to the south, and it would like to develop its trade with the north and the east. And the One Silk One Road, of course, would not only link Iran and China, but it would also be an incentive for countries in Central Asia to develop their economies. So it would be an extraordinarily powerful boost. The only threat, of course, is instability in Central Asia, and therefore countries in the region must take care that extremists do not find a foothold in any of these countries.
Professor Morandi, you are a political scientist. You know this better than I do, that Iran really has to keep a very delicate balance. On the one hand, it's an influential country in the region, therefore shouldering certain responsibilities. But Iran, by history, particularly being portrayed by the media, must be believed by some as having different agendas and egos. So how is Iran likely to keep a delicate balance in that regard for others to feel, China, including China, to feel that Iran is a safe political partner and is a safe trade partner in the future as well?
Well, I think with regards to politics, the very fact that Iran has very close relations with its neighbors, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, is evidence in itself. Both Iraq and Afghanistan are very vulnerable to extremism. The sort of both Al-Qaeda and ISIL exist in both countries. Yet the central government of Iraq, as well as the central government of Afghanistan, rely heavily on Iran to prevent these sort of extremist groups from gaining the upper hand. Of course, there are other countries that help them as well, but I think the very fact that Iran's immediate neighbors are so closely associated with the country is evidence in itself. While Iran has been invaded with U.S. and European support under Saddam Hussein, Iran has never had any intention to retaliate. In fact, the new Iraqi government the post-Saddam Hussein government is now considered to be Iran's most important trading partner in the region. So the fact that Iran can develop ties so quickly and so extensively and create an alliance with the country which was at war with it just a couple of days ago, I think itself is evidence enough.
We see a very confident Professor Morandi with his country's future, of course, but it is not just Iran, which is an interesting case study to have along China's Belt and Road initiatives. There are also other countries who traditionally with China, even in history, many fascinating stories. And of course, what I'm talking about is Italy. Focus on Italy for now, which sits at the end point of the maritime Silk Road. The friendship between China and Italy dates back hundreds of years when Marco Polo embarked on a trip to Asia, during which he spent 17 years in China. His reports helped familiarize Italian people and also the Europeans with Chinese civilization. And then during the Ming Dynasty, Italian missionary Matteo Ricci also came to China and was one of the first promoters of Catholicism in China. He formed a cultural bridge between the two countries. These are all very, very important history for the two countries. Of course, now we have outbound investment coming from China to Italy. Therefore, let me go to you, Mr. Casarini. History is there, but the thing is, how can we make a new version of history? How much can the Road and Belt initiatives likely to help with that from Italian perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me at in this program. And that's an important question. The Belt and Road is possibly China's biggest diplomatic and geopolitical initiative in decades. And Italy, as you mentioned, stands in a very particular position at the center of the Mediterranean. Now, how can we make a win-win situation whereby Chinese investments are coming towards the Mediterranean and Europe, and so the thing could be beneficial for both? But essentially, it's about to create those conditions whereby the investments from China create jobs and opportunities in Europe, and this is what it is happening right now, especially in Italy. There has been a great inflow of Chinese investments in the last years. But it is also the other way around. The Belt and Road is not only about investments and infrastructure, it's also about people, connectivity between people. You mentioned Marco Polo and Matteo Ricci. Nowadays, more and more young people, students from Italy, other parts of Europe, go more and more to China, Chinese students, and other people come to Europe. I think this is also another important aspect of the Belt and Road, connectivity between people.
Right, connectivity, yes indeed, but it is no secret that European countries, Italy for example, has been experiencing some dramatic economic challenges over the years. The question is also not only about opportunities going into Italy, but rather how Italy is likely, with the help of Belt and Road initiatives, catching the opportunity and reinvent yourself. On that point, I know Europeans love to debate, Dr. Casarini. I wonder whether there are similar debates going on in your countries as well.
Yes, yes, you touched a very important point, the reinvention of a situation, given the possibilities provided by the Belt and Road. I'll give you two examples. One is infrastructure, but the other one is logistics. Italy is full of ports, and now, for the time being, there has been the direction investments has been to Greece, like in the port of Piraeus, and to some extent to Spanish ports. Now, Italy stands to benefit in providing the political and economic conditions to accept the Chinese investments in Italian ports. That's an important element for Italy to reinvent itself, to become again what has traditionally been in centuries the heart of the Mediterranean. And another element is, of course, as I mentioned before, connectivity between people, tourism. The tourist industry. Now, more and more Chinese people go abroad, and as we know, Italy is possibly one of the most visited countries, and the country that houses the largest amount of treasures when it comes to archaeology, museums, etc. So again, here we have the possibility. Now, the problem is the political level. because like there are like some parts of the population that have negative attitudes towards China. So the importance at this point of having the political elite to be able to indicate that there are huge benefits and those concerns which are inevitable that need to be managed. But I think like nowadays the opportunities still surpass the drawbacks.
Ms. He, you've been attentively listened to your two other colleagues earlier. That's from their perspective. Yes. But what about from China, when China is developing this multilateralism? You see Belt and Road as an interesting example. The Belt and Road initiatives go along regions in which there has been enormous prosperity, multicultural rather, but at the same time, some political ups and downs, geopolitical complexes, wars involved. Meanwhile, there has also been economic challenges, just to mention a few. How would China be able to deal with all of this? After all, China cannot dictate what others can do, could only be of support with the willingness of the others. So that puts China in a very interesting position that it has to sharpen its skills and capabilities.
Right, you are very right. You know, in Chinese words, there is a very interesting word called 危机, pronounced in the Mandarin, which means the opportunity always hands in hand with these challenges. So you are quite right. You're all the way around this one belt, one road. You can see the political situation, some area is not so stable. As our Iranian friend said, Iran has been surrounded by those countries now with some chaos. So, but that couldn't, prevented those Belt Road Initiative marching forward. Now I recall earlier this year, President Xi Jinping visited Saudi and also Iran. At that time, these two countries happened to be at a very complicated relationship. They even cut diplomatic ties. So some opinions saying, well, maybe that's not the good time for give this visit. But President Xi still goes there. So which means, because they have some chaos, and then China can play its role. Not only this connectivity about economic ties, we also can do some connectivity things for funding those, the relations with them. So we can build, serving as a bridge role for, passing some message between them and also trying to persuade them to sit around the negotiation table. Right. So that's the one thing. I think another connectivity, I fully agree with our Italian colleagues, that's the connectivity of people. So Chinese tourists now not only goes to United States, goes to South Asian countries, we also go to Iran, go to Italy. I have been to Italy 3 times. So it is so gorgeous. I think, the experience.
All right.
So many wonderful places.
Okay, enough the promotion for one country.
Yes.
So let's move on to the topics. So Professor Morandi, of course, Mr. Casarini is very happy for the moment, but let me also make Professor Morandi involved as well. Professor, China's strong point to Iran, for example, and others as you see it, is it the basic economic ties, or is it the ever-rising role of China into geopolitics of the world? Which one do you think is the most fundamental and most sustainable?
I think it is both. Obviously, the growth of the Chinese economy is both good news for the people of China, but it's also good for those countries that do trade with it, and the same is true with a country like Iran or Italy. But at the same time, I think that the Iranians believe China has played a very constructive role in global politics. The Chinese were, for example, very much opposed to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which led to a lot of the catastrophes that we see today. The Iranians also oppose it. Iran was the only country in the region, actually, or the only country that neighbored Iraq that was opposed to the war. Or, for example, the NATO destruction of Libya. And the rise of extremism as well is something that's of deep concern to our Chinese counterparts when we have discussions. So the role of China, I think, is something that is welcomed. The same is true, I think, at least in the case of Iran, with regards to the Russian involvement in the region, as well as the Russian role in the UN Security Council in preventing Western unilateral action in countries. So it is a combination of both, but so far, unlike Western European countries and countries in North America that have had centuries of colonization, the Chinese have been far more responsible, and hopefully in the coming years and decades we will see that pattern continue.
On the one hand, China hold on to the policy of not to interfere in others' internal affairs, but on the other hand, as China's role different in the world, China also has to play sometimes a go-betweener, and meanwhile understand better what's going on in others' internal issues. Professor He, here comes the challenge. How to make that balance? This is what we talk about when it comes to Chinese diplomacy. What do you make of the current situation?
Yes, the non-interference policy has been long serving as our diplomatic principle. I don't think there is any reason now to throw this principle into a rubbish can, because nowadays, when you look about the international setup, there's a lot of power politics going on, a lot of hegemonicism going on. So at this critical moment, the non-interference policy needs to be insisted on, but we also need to take some flexible attitude. For example, like this Sudan Darfur issue. This is the issue I often pick it up as an example, because those issues has been, like Syria crisis as well. It has been already upgraded into an international things. So being as permanent member of the UN Security Council, China has to play its responsibility to offer some initiative or some the idea to trying to work it out.
I see. This is, of course, an enormous issue, so-called the multilateralism of China's diplomacy. But for now, we have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for the three of you, He Wenping, Mohammed Marandi, and Nicola Castarini. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight, CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.